Okay. Yeah, it's good. Probably begin. Good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm Christopher Hoyer from Princeton's Department of Art and Archaeology. Welcome to the sixth and penultimate lecture in the Art as Knowledge series. Sorry? Penultimate, I said. Boy, grammar quiz. My thanks as always to the IAS, to Departmental Chair Hal Foster, and to my fellow organizer and wordsmith here, Yvan Lambois, for his support. Our speaker tonight is Zana Barani, currently Edith Parada Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. A native of Baghdad, Professor Barani has emerged as nothing less than one of our generation's most eminent scholars of ancient Near Eastern art. An active archaeologist who currently excavates with Yale in Syria, the author of 3 books on Mesopotamia, and most recently, a scholar sought out for her thoughtful and acute commentary on the recent destruction and attempts at rescue of Iraq's cultural heritage. Zana received her PhD from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts in 1989, after which she served for 4 years as assistant curator of Near Eastern art at the Metropolitan Museum. She then moved to SUNY Stony Brook until 2001, where she was a visiting professor, and then was a visiting professor at the University of Vienna's Institute for Orientalistik, before coming to Columbia in 2002, where I was very fortunate to work with her briefly as a lowly postdoc. Professor Barani is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, among them a Guggenheim, and since 2003 has been part of the UNESCO group on Iraq and the Iraq Task Force of the Getty Conservation Institute and the World Monument Fund. As the senior consultant for the Coalition Provisional Authority, she played a key role in beginning reconstruction of the National Museum of Iraq and raised some of the first and most intelligent alarms about the looting and destruction U.S. forces permitted to take place there, most notably in a piece written for The Nation in May of 2003. An exhibition that she curated most recently at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia, called Modernism and Iraq, is on view until March 28th. Now, Professor Barani's most recent book, Rituals of War, published in 2008 by Zone, perhaps fits better than any other into this lecture's thematic of knowledge. Writing about the justification of omens and portents that certain Mesopotamian leaders made for violence, she writes that, quote, "There, the supernatural served to facilitate the ground rules of war, and that one's own idea was the correct system of rule to justify warfare, torture, or violence," a statement with clear and rather eerie homologies to our own time. Her talk tonight will draw upon work from 2 projects currently underway, one on the Ottoman context of modern archaeology, and the second on antiquarianism in Mesopotamia, Mesopotamian antiquity, or as she has written, quote, "what the ancients themselves thought of the traces of the past," end quote. Responding to Professor Barani's talk tonight will be Beata Pongratz-Leisten, who is Associate Lecturer at Princeton University, former member here at the IAS, and happy to announce, beginning in fall of 2009, Associate Professor at NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. Dr. Pongratz-Leisten, whose current research deals with kingship and divinity in ancient Mesopotamia, will offer some short remarks following the talk, after which we'll have questions and a reception to which you're all invited. But enough of me. Please welcome Zana Barani, whose paper, as you can see, is entitled Sovereign Power, Death, and Monuments. Zana.
Thank you all for inviting me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Christopher, for that very kind introduction. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to you about my work here and also to see so many old friends in the audience. So thanks for taking out your time today to come and hear me. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay, because I am wired, but I'm not sure if it's switched on. Over the mic? I think that I'm supposed to be hooked up, so I hope that this is going to work, but if not, maybe they can switch up my volume. So do let me know if you don't hear me clearly. The assignment to address the theme of this lecture series, exploring art as knowledge, would on the face of it seem to be an effortless task for an archaeologist. For exploring art for information comes with the territory of ancient art. Scholars of antiquity often look at works of art, of visual art, as a place from which to glean the historical kernel of truth, reading images as if they were windows open onto an ancient world. But to take the task quite literally, that is, as I understand it, to explore art itself in its art form as knowledge, to ask questions of its art form, is something that ancient Near Eastern scholarship has not really been inclined to consider. Let's take what is undoubtedly the most famous monument from ancient Mesopotamia, the Codex Hammurabi. Although it's illustrated in every introductory art history text and world civilizations course from east to west, little attention is paid to this monument as a monument or as a work of sculpture. Instead, even art books include the stele because it is considered one of the so-called firsts of civilization. When it was first found in 1902, it was considered to be the oldest law code in the history of the world. So the text has always taken precedence, even though we now know that it's not the earliest set of laws from Mesopotamia. And here on the image on the screen, you see the top part of the monument as it's usually illustrated instead of the entire monument itself. And this is a 1947 photo when they're removing it, when they're bringing it back into the gallery after having removed it in Paris. In most cases of ancient Near Eastern art, we actually have the opposite problem. Ever since Sir Austen Henry Layard, that gallant young adventurer in the service of the British Embassy, removed the reliefs out of the walls of the palaces of Assyria in the 1840s, the inscriptions have been ignored when the images are studied. Layard then decided that it would be easier to package and ship the reliefs to the newly constructed British Museum building if the slabs would be cut down even further. And cutting the inscriptions from the marble panels often seemed to him like a good solution to this 19th century Englishman who came to save these antiquities for science and for history. And it's quite ironic, but this, you can see here what was the standard, the so-called standard inscription, really cut through the center to make it easier to transport. So of course the inscriptions were logically seen as another form of knowledge from the art being understood by Layard as figurative representation. And the idea that art must mean a mimetic, figurative image has not entirely left the scholarship of the ancient Near East. But let's take the question put to us here today more directly. Can we take the notion of art not just as something that may or may not fall under mimetic image, but as a work that is in some sense timeless as art? Can we look at a work of art, even one created in 3000 BC, more or less, like the Uruk vase, or in around 650 BC, like this image here on the left, an Assyrian relief, and think more broadly about aesthetic, representational, or philosophical issues, for example? I have to admit that I have fallen into this practice in recent years myself, especially during the years of the Bush administration, and as a result of witnessing the horrors of war in Iraq when I was there, especially in 2003 and 2004. In studying images of war, I began to think about the technologies of warfare at the level of the irrational, rituals of violence that are clearly still at play in today's world. So I would like to take the question further to ask something counterintuitive for an archaeologist. I would like to ask, do works of art only make sense within their specific historical and cultural context? Does art as knowledge mean to glean contextual, historical, or archaeological data out of the work of art through empirical observation? Is the relationship of knowledge and art limited to one of historical context? Of course, this is what we answer in the affirmative as scholars of antiquity, since the distant past seems really like a foreign land, but also because the cultures of the ancient Near East are so maligned and misunderstood. They are the barbarous other of classical antiquity, while at the same time being classified as the primitive, not quite civilized past of the Western story of civilization. For all these reasons, an artifact must be understood in its own cultural context. That's an obvious point for all archaeologists. However, I would like to turn this fundamental rule around for a moment. I would like to consider instead how a work of art has an endless life, how the efficacy of the image or the monument transcends its historical and cultural context, how the power of the work of art is not simply a mechanistic power of a local ideology manipulated by the direct hand of the ruler or his henchmen. So, in some sense, I think I'm acting rather Babylonian in my thought processes here. Because for the ancient Mesopotamians, works of art, such as these famous works here, the votive image of Lunana, made out of arsenical copper and gold in the era of Hammurabi, is this beautiful votive meant to represent Lunana for eternity through the image, or this colossal magnificent image of Gudea, quite monumental in form and in the manufacture and the aesthetic concern of its manufacture, is also meant to stand for all time. That was the point of these sorts of images. So in some sense, I am acting rather Babylonian in my thought processes here, because for the ancient Mesopotamians, works of art and the passage of historical time are closely related. Works of art are linked to destiny, to the past, and to the future in very direct ways. And this can be demonstrated quite easily, both archaeologically and philologically. Even in antiquity, according to its own historical logic, works of art had meaning long beyond their context of manufacture and first use. For example, this colossal statue of Gudea and the larger part of the Gudea statues were not found in an archaeological level in which Gudea ruled. Instead, they were found in a palace. They were excavated in a palace of the Hellenistic period. So they were already thousands of years old when they were being reused, represented inside the context of that palace. So even according to, the works had meaning long beyond their context of manufacture, even in their own historical context. I will therefore hazard a declaration here and say that for the ancient Mesopotamians, a work of art was precisely an aesthetically made work that is at once historically specific and timeless. Excuse me. I have tried to point out in many publications that our field has been so inclined to see Mesopotamian art as the overt manipulative ideology of priests and despots that it has in fact neglected some fundamental areas of human experience and response to the visual realm. These are the areas of belief, of the irrational, of enchantment, and yes, even of art itself. Today I would like to look closely at two ancient monuments, works of art that continue to be efficacious in our own time. In my view, this is what we can call the continuous lifespan of the work of art, a lifespan that I believe that the Mesopotamians were very conscious of and which led to the invention of the monument in the first place. So a distinctive type of artifact from ancient Mesopotamia is described as a stele in modern scholarship and as a naru in the ancient Babylonian texts. These naru are perhaps the earliest formulation of a historical work of art. While public and historical monuments existed in other times and places and are perhaps best known from Roman antiquity, the Mesopotamian example presents a fascinating case study because it has no precedent. From the ancient texts inscribed upon them, we can see that such monuments were concerned with the topoi of time and memory, with the harnessing of event, terrain, and carved record together in a monument meant to stand for all time. These monuments were displayed publicly at sites of commemoration and were to become a part of a complex historical topography, a physical terrain that was contested and literally became subjected to war games when battles were fought with the aim of smashing and removing monuments from their place. At the same time, there is an intangible historical topography in the memory and in the discourse of monuments themselves that existed already in antiquity in forms of ekphrasis and written catalogs, as well as collecting and reuse of antiquities. These freestanding and roughly hewn slabs of stone are made of enduring materials such as limestone, alabaster, basalt, or diorite. They are carved in relief with narrative scenes, often on all sides. For example, here we have the stele of Sargon, who is considered to be the founder of the Akkadian dynasty. His name is inscribed next to him. His troops are walking behind him. It's a very fragmentary stele, but yet it is monumental in material, in form, and in carving style. And one of the very earliest monuments we have, the so-called stele of Eannatum, or the stele of the vultures, found in fragments, again in a Hellenistic level. So they are carved in relief with narratives and inscribed in cuneiform script. The names of the rulers who commissioned them appear on the monuments unless the inscription has been broken. Perhaps because of the ubiquitousness of the text on all of these monuments, all of them, even the earliest one here, has vast amounts of text written all over and in between the images on both sides. So perhaps because of the ubiquitousness of the texts, they have been studied not as artifacts in themselves, and certainly even less so as works of art. Rather, even by ancient Near Eastern art historians, they are usually studied as documents from which accurate historical accounts can be reconstructed. Sometimes from several unrelated fragments, using a philological method of reconstructing text after gleaning the historical truth out of the ideological message. So this is the way that we work with ancient texts, when we just have fragments and we need to reconstruct an account. We take the bits and pieces from different unrelated tablets, and this seems to be a methodology that we've applied also to the arts, a methodology that may work quite well with literary text, but with artwork, of course, it becomes an obstacle. The stele of Naram Sin, a king of the 23rd century BC, depicts an Akkadian victory in war over the Lulubi, who lived in the Zagros Mountains to the northeast of Mesopotamia. It was excavated in 1898 at Susa in Iran. The fragmentary inscription at the upper left names Naram Sin as the mighty victor, and the Lulubi here is the place of the inscription. It's been effaced at a certain point, but it names Naram Sin as the victor, and the Lulubi ruler here, Sidur, and the Highlanders as the vanquished. The second inscription on the mountainside here was added as an act of disfigurement and appropriation in a war that took place more than a millennium later, in the 12th century BC. When the monument was removed, we know according to the inscription, from Sipar in southern Iraq to Susa in Iran. I will not go into the details of the inscriptions or an analysis of the iconoclastic gesture that brought the monument to Iran, as I have written about these issues extensively already. Instead, I want to outline briefly my reading of the stele as a work of art that represents sovereign power in a way that is both historically contextualized in Mesopotamian culture and at the same time timeless. The stele of Naram Sin is a consciously historicizing monument. To say this may be to state the obvious, but in antiquity, this was one of the first works to formulate intentionally a historical image. What is carved on the stele is not a mythical or a generic scene of victory and conquest. It is a depiction of an event, a moment that can be historically located. It stands at the beginning of a long tradition of public monuments and memorials that continue into the present day. But the stele of Naram Sin is not just a scene of a particular victory, whether accurately and truthfully recorded, imbued with ideology, or distorted by propaganda. It is an artifact of a particular historical juncture in which kingship itself changed conceptually and metamorphosed into a new form that would come to influence the concept of kingship and the principles of royal authority for centuries to come. So, keeping in mind Alain Badiou's philosophical definition of an event with a capital E as some occurrence or moment that breaks with the known or normative situation, we might consider that the stele inscribes the event into permanence. It is a monument of an event, a moment that ruptures the perceived passage of historical time. What is carved on it is indeed a representation of a historical battle. The battle against the Lulubi, the Akkadians are victorious. But at the same time, what we can see in this stele is also an artifact of the historical juncture in which kingship, a form of rule which had until that time been conceived of in limited terms and within the local structure of the city-state, came to be defined as sovereign power. The stele of Naram Sin is not just the victory stele, quote unquote, the title ascribed to it by modern scholarship. It is a monument of a new authority, a form of rule that ceases to be a socio-political office and presents itself instead as a category of ontology. We can begin by making some visual observations on the stele of Naram Sin. The roughly hewn limestone slab in its entirety here, which is fragmentary, is well over 2 meters in height. So in antiquity, it would have been even much larger than that. It is carved after the event of the battle. Therefore, it has a temporal distance from it. It is not a direct observation of a battle scene, nor does it seem to aspire to representing what would appear as a battle in progress. Despite the fact that the fragmentary inscription above the image of Naram Sin records the military campaign, the scene itself appears to be somewhat ceremonial. The king himself is the apex of the scene, and this is the king, Naram Sin. He's larger than the troops below him and central to the composition. His body is portrayed as the ideal masculine body, carved with a new modeled naturalism, with an emphasis on musculature, a virile and alluring body. In Akkadian, we have the word kuzbu to describe this kind of alluring virility, with broad shoulders, narrow waist, and emphatic musculature of biceps and thighs. As part of his battle gear, he wears the horned crown of a god. Never previously has this horned crown been worn by any Mesopotamian ruler. The visual narrative certainly deploys the magnificent body of the king silhouetted against the sky, emerging at the mounted top in all his royal splendor. But beyond the muscular physical body and divine kingly attire of Naram Sin, there is something more. There is the central place of death in the image. Let us consider that the stele of Naram Sin is more than a monument of victory regarding a specific battle. That perhaps it is a monument of kingship in relation to war. In other words, that the image represents the king as one who defeats and subjugates others through violence and physical aggression. How is the masculinity in the image displayed in and through the notion of kuzbu, a term that denotes a charismatic sexual allure, here merged with violence? How is the body of the king inserted into a narrative that involves time? How is the body of the king embedded into an image of history? These are all aspects of this work that emerge through a formal reading of the stele as a work of art. There is something about the compositional use of violence in the stele of Naram Sin that seems to me important, but has never been addressed directly. Violence is central, literally and formally speaking, to the composition of the stele. It is what I would call its cipher. Look closely at the scene. At the center of the composition, in this area, Naram Sin stands, larger than life, his left foot placed on the naked bodies of the enemies. The point at which Naram Sin's foot meets the bodies of the dead, we see a pinwheel formation. The horizontal bodies lie in different directions, with heads at right and left of the scene. Some bodies have fallen loose from this knot of death and tumbled down the mountainside. Here. The wounded enemy's foot meets the bodies of the dead at the edge of the mountain. At the point where Naram Sin's disproportionately large foot presses down upon the bodies of the dead. Victory is central to the theme of the stele, yet to think of it merely in terms of victory or even war and violence is to miss the point. It is not just violence, but death, or rather life and death, that is the subject of the composition here. Here in the cipher of the pinwheel of bodies, Naram Sin's power is underscored centrally through his express power over life and death, over the bodies of the other, which is what Michel Foucault in his treatise on power, discipline, and punish described as sovereign power in its clearest form. The king's body is therefore virile and alluring, but it is essentially violent. It is important to see that this is not just a generic depiction of masculinity as violence, a device that appears elsewhere in ancient art, including in other periods in Mesopotamian history. This is a physical violence taken to its limit as a power over the body of the other. We can read this in the image of the Lulubi ruler pleading for his life, here, and the fallen warrior collapsing before him. Visually and formally speaking, Naram Sin's power is expressed as the power over life and death. It is the nucleus of this new sovereign power expressed here visually for the first time. Paraphrasing the philosopher Giorgio Agamben's recent writings on Homo Sacer, we can say that placing the control of the body of the other and of life itself at the center of the image, the monument brings to light the secret tie uniting sovereign power and bare life. In other words, the link between absolute power and biopolitics. As such, the Stele of Naram Sin, as a work of art, continues to bring to light the forces of absolute power that have been harnessed by the rulers of our own time. A power that has been so clearly expressed in the US and the UK, especially as a new interplay of the biopolitical and the state of exception. This is now presented to us as a temporary expedient of detention without charge, of torture and biometric controls, but which is in fact the ancient structure of sovereign power itself. But let us return to the Stele of Hammurabi. The scholarly discussions surrounding the Codex Hammurabi are fairly standard. Is it a law code or not? How many copies existed? How did it go to Susa? Where was it placed in Susa? What is the iconographic meaning of the image at the top of the stele? These are all questions that have arisen in our scholarship. And I will not rehearse these arguments here today. What for me is remarkable about this work of art is that it is the conceptualization of law itself in a monument. It is a work of art that turns the concept of law into a sublime object by means of the monument itself. The Codex Hammurabi is a monolithic pillar towering over 2 meters, well over 2 meters in height. It's about 7.5 feet as it stands, made out of black basalt. And it is brilliantly polished to a high, almost metallic sheen. The larger part of the oblong pillar is covered with cuneiform script. You can see a detail here. All of this is script, and this is the image. The way it's usually depicted in text is we usually just see the top part. Instead of representing the entire object as the work of art, we are shown just the upper part there. But the elegant and beautifully carved script is aesthetically conceived and a deliberately archaizing form of writing. It is clearly a script for presentation. And here you can see a close-up of this script. 23 columns of writing appear on the front. The last 7 of them were erased presumably by the Elamites when the monument was taken to Susa from Babylon as war booty. And 28 columns of writing appear on the back. 5 columns of text at the beginning and at the end are written as a prologue and an epilogue to the list of the laws. Because the laws were compiled on the inscription, cannot be said to cover all areas of the law, its identification as a law code is no longer accepted by scholars of the ancient Near East. the monument is now generally defined as one that represents Hammurabi as king of justice, listing some legal decisions without being a complete code of laws, because not all areas of the law are represented. At the top part of one side, a scene carved in relief appears above the text. Here, Hammurabi is shown in front of the god, Shamash. Hammurabi's proximity to the space of the god is significant. He enters his world. The space of the sacred and the profane is merged in ways that are perhaps even more alarming than the stele of Naram-Sin, or Naram-Sin's transfiguration of himself into a divinity. Hammurabi has come face to face with the god in very close proximity. He's smaller than the god Shamash, yet very like him in many respects. In the usual Mesopotamian presentation scene, commonly used in cylinder seal images, such as this Babylonian image, although this may represent a king and not a god. But here we have a deity and a worshiper before him, and these are the typical sorts of scenes that we have where there is either an interceding goddess making an introduction, or there is an altar in between the spaces, and that's much more to be expected for this kind of iconography. So Hammurabi has really come face to face with the god, and he's quite like him in many respects. Shamash appears on the right. He wears a divine horned crown and is seated on a throne that takes the shape of a temple. And I should just go on to the next one. Here you can see him again. With his right hand, he holds the emblems of rule before the king. Hammurabi holds his right hand up to his lips in a gesture of worship, and he wears the attire and headdress of a mortal. There is nothing about him that would indicate a body that is more than human. Physically, Hammurabi is a mere man. He is no divinity as Naram-Sin is divine. He holds none of the weapons of the warrior king, despite the fact that the prologue of the text describes his remarkable, extensive military conquests. Here the king is a mortal, but he is nevertheless enclosed in the space of the god. By means of the image, we can say that the stele of Hammurabi is a monument that configures the place of the ruler in relation to the law and authority. But the pictorial image is, of course, not the work of art. Instead, we must look at the entire monument as the work of art. In his 1921 essay on the critique of violence, Walter Benjamin writes on the relationship of justice, authority, law, and violence. He expands on the implications of war, of conscription, the right to strike and revolution, and the state's monopolization of violence. The investigation brings up his disturbing insight into the structure of law. He writes, and I quote, "In the exercise of violence over life and death, more than in any legal act, law reaffirms itself. But in this very violence, something rotten in law is revealed." End of quote. For Benjamin, this concealed originary violence is the hidden core of law. Jacques Derrida's 1989 essay on the force of the law is a deconstruction of Benjamin's essay on the power of law and justice. Law's authority depends on what Derrida calls the mystical force of the law. But reading Derrida's essay, it becomes clear that it is not the mystical force or the originary violence that enables law that is the rotten thing at law's core, as Benjamin defined it. It is that law contains the possibility of the state of exception within it, the exception that cancels and takes away access to the law. It is a paradox of justice that it depends on this force, according to Derrida. However, that is not the disturbing secret of the law. It is secrecy itself, the inaccessibility to law, that is the hidden evil or the structural flaw of law. The inaccessibility to law is bizarre and disturbing, as Kafka's novel, The Trial, so vividly shows. Of course, the Kafkaesque nightmare of Joseph K., the protagonist in Kafka's story, is that the law is secret. This aspect of the story is clearly underscored in the parable you probably all remember. The priest tells K of the man who waits outside the door of the law all his life and never gains access to it until time comes for him to die. In his code, Hammurabi declares the opposite. He states outright, and I quote, "Let any wronged man who has a legal case come before my image, and let him have my inscribed stele read aloud to him." I say before my image for those of you who know the text in the audience. I differ from the translation which reads it as "before my statue as king of justice," because "ana mahar salmiya shar misharem" I think really refers to just my image as king of justice. Little philological aside. It is so this monument is the formulation of justice as a monument that truly takes the law out of the secret realm of sovereign power. It makes the law public by means of the monument. It puts it out for all to see. The concept of justice is then not something that is simply in the content of the specific laws and decisions that Hammurabi makes that are listed here in the text. It is the monument itself. It is certainly not the case, of course, that Hammurabi's rule doesn't monopolize violence or narrate over and conceal the split of violence present at the founding of the law, but the monument is nevertheless remarkable in its formulation of justice as open to the people. Hammurabi's power is more subtly expressed than Naram-Sin's in his stele. It is the power to decide punishments. But what Hammurabi's monument also declares is that justice is just in its accessibility. Justice, in order to be justice, cannot be secret, and it must be public. This notion of justice is promulgated by means of the monument itself. Hammurabi declares explicitly in the epilogue that he has inscribed and set up this monument, quote, "before my image as king of justice in the city of Babylon," end of quote. And then another place, quote, "in order that the mighty not wrong the weak, to provide just ways for the waif and the widow," end of quote. The monument of Hammurabi therefore constitutes a horizon of juridical certainty, even if it is not a codex of law. The text reads in a standard formulation of protasis and apodosis that we know from other ancient Near Eastern texts. So I quote, as an example, "if X crime, then Y punishment." Most famously, we know this from Law 196. If a man should blind the eye of another man, they shall blind his eye. It is a scientific, and one could argue even a metaphysical formulation of law. As a monument, its presence articulates the force of the law as transcendental, even beyond the actual cases mentioned in the 300 and some specific examples. It is not each case that is the subject here, but law itself in the abstract notion. The Codex Hammurabi then demonstrates beautifully Blaise Pascal's argument that the law is based only in the act of its own enunciation. The monument of Hammurabi is not a law code, yet it is nevertheless a codification of law. It is a monument to the abstract metaphysical notion of juridical power annexed by the sovereign, the force of the law, a force that certainly involves the lives of others. The law is listed are specific instances of the wise decisions that Hammurabi has announced. They are decrees. In legal doctrine, force of the law technically refers not to the standard laws, as I understand it, but to decrees that the executive power can issue in exceptional situations. This is more or less equivalent to an authority which is exceptional. So as Giambattista Vico wrote, an esteemed jurist, I quote, an esteemed jurist is therefore not someone who, with the help of a good memory, masters positive law, but rather someone who, with sharp judgment, knows how to look into cases and see the ultimate circumstances of facts that merit equitable consideration and exceptions from the general rule, end of quote. The epilogue of the Codex Hammurabi states that Hammurabi set up these laws in Babylon before his image as king of justice, thus presenting himself as one who dispenses the just laws. This is why he declares at the end, "May any wronged man who has a case come before my image as king of justice, may he have my inscribed stele read aloud to him." It is his image as king of justice that we see here. The Codex Hammurabi is therefore a monument that also reconfigures the relationship of the ruler to the law. Other laws existed before the law code of Hammurabi, and there is even evidence that some may have been inscribed on monuments. The laws of Lipit Ishtar, who reigned some 150 years before Hammurabi, are preserved on several old Babylonian cuneiform tablets found at Nippur. The copies of the text were probably made from a standing monument that no longer survived then. The epilogue of the laws of Lipit Ishtar reads, and I quote, "When I established justice in the lands of Sumer and Akkad, I erected the stele. He who will not do anything evil to it, who will not damage my work, who will not efface my inscription and write his own name on it, may he be granted life and breadth of long days. May he raise his neck to heaven in the Acor temple. May the god Enlil's brilliant countenance be turned upon him from above." End of quote. In Susa, where the Codex Hammurabi was found, other fragments of monuments were found that may have been copies or similar to the one we see here. The people of antiquity continued to see these monuments, like the Hammurabi Code, for hundreds of years. Ancient scholars looked at them, copied them, and referenced them so that they became indeed timeless. The text of the Codex Hammurabi was copied numerous times over the centuries, even well over a millennium after its manufacture. It was therefore accessible and important to the ancients themselves as an enduring monument, and not just to us because we teach our school children that these are the first laws. In the stele of Naram Sin, a new conception of sovereign power is expressed in Naram Sin's historical position as the telos of historical time that sets not so much his reign, but his form of authority apart from all those before. This new conception of kingship was formulated and underscored through the body of the king. What is of greater significance in Naram Sin stele is that in both juridical and supernatural terms, it is the ruler's relationship to death and to violence that has changed. Considered in all its radicality, the ontological shift is biopolitical, insofar as it constitutes absolute power as the sovereign's ultimate right to deal the blow of death. We have never seen before the stele of Naram Sin in ancient Mesopotamia an image of a king or a mortal dealing the blow of death. Before that, it was always the god. And with Naram Sin, this is an incredible change in the iconography, that he deals the blow of death himself. He stands upon the bodies of the other. This ancient shift in the parameters of power, which inscribed the absolute authority of the sovereign into the body of the other, demonstrates a point again made by Giorgio Agamben. And I quote from Agamben. "It can even be said that the production of a biopolitical body is the original activity of sovereign power. In this sense, biopolitics is at least as old as the sovereign exception. Placing biological life at the center of its calculations, the modern state therefore does nothing other than to bring to light the secret tie uniting power and bare life, thereby reaffirming the bond derived from a tenacious correspondence between the modern and the archaic, which one encounters in the most diverse spheres between modern power and the most immemorial of the arcana imperi, end of quote. There are profound differences in the declaration of royal power by Naram Sin and Hammurabi, and even between these ancient kings and today's forms of authoritarian rule. In the Codex Hammurabi, what we see is the formulation of justice as a transcendental force prior to the king or his just decisions. Because it is expressed by means of a carved and polished basalt stele, the monument's main point is to take the law out of the closed realm of power and make it open and public. And while the earlier law steles probably existed in Mesopotamia, Hammurabi's stele remains a remarkable monument in the realm of politics, art, and jurisprudence. I shall end by pointing to the first law of the Codex Hammurabi. I quote, "If a man accuses another man and charges him with homicide, but cannot bring proof against him, his accuser shall be killed." The first law is a law we can recognize as habeas corpus, one which we have blithely done away with in the last few years. The following three laws are also laws regarding making accusations without evidence and holding people without evidence until we reach Law 5, which turns to the subject of the corruption of judges. Because of their place at the opening of the laws, they seem to frame the laws, the following laws that come after them, and to underscore habeas corpus as fundamental to law itself, to justice itself. But the formulation of justice is clearly not in the letter of the law alone. It is in the monumentalization. The public access to the law and legal proceedings, as opposed to secret laws and secret trials, are also essential to the rule of law. These are two aspects of law that are clearly articulated in the Codex Hammurabi, and that were formulated into a notion of sublime justice by means of this timeless monument. Thank you. And I think we will now hear a response from Dr. Pongratz-Leisten. Beate.
I hope he is coming and helping me too. Can you help me with this? I forgot this. Oh, okay. Thanks. Thank you very much to the organizers who invited me today to give the response to Zeinab Bahrani. And I'm very much looking forward to future cooperations with Zeinab at NYU and Columbia. Informed by the works of the French philosopher, historian, and sociologist Michel Foucault and the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, Zeinab Bahrani, in the first part of her lecture, presents us with a sophisticated view on death to illuminate the meaning of royal violence in the ancient Near East. Thereby, she focuses on the sovereign's power and control over the other's body. Likewise, inspired by Walter Benjamin's view on the structure of law, concealing originary violence, she associates in a new and very daring move the Hammurabi stele, which bears his image and his laws, with the theme of death. I do not have the time to discuss the philosophical underpinnings of Zeinab's argument. Instead, I would like to concentrate on what killing means in the ancient Near Eastern worldview and adduce some information drawn from historical inscriptions, mythic narratives, as well as theological speculative texts. The Sumerian poem of Enki and Inanna includes a long list of the so-called me, which consist of the cultural and cultic norms, institutions, and aspects of positive and negative human behavior. In short, comprise the positive and negative aspects of civilization. Among these are aspects associated with war, of which in historiographic tradition the positive ones are linked with the type of the heroic warrior, while the negative ones are said to characterize the enemy. And so we get the sword and the club, and then the mythological weapon of the flood, and then the positive characteristics of a royal and divine warrior, heroism, power, righteousness, and the negative characteristics of the enemy, which is wickedness, deceit, and then the rebel lands, and strategies of warfare, such as the plundering of cities. The list of the Me, as presented in the myth of Enki and Inanna, provides us with the important information that in the ancient Near East, disruptive elements, such as the rebellious enemy, were considered as antagonistic forces within the cosmos, and that it remained the continuous task of the divine warrior and the earthly king to integrate these elements into the existing order. Warfare and consequently killing are necessary to establish and maintain political order, and with it peace and prosperity. In the ancient Near East, creation thus remains part of the present time and is not restricted to the cosmological narratives about the beginnings. This concept is evident in combat myths such as a Sumerian poem revolving around the warrior god Ninurta, which elaborates on the notion of killing as a means of transforming the former disruptive force into a cosmic element. It relates how Ninurta's foe, Asak, is turned into a big rock and his entrails become the netherworld. I quote, "From today forward, do not say Asak, its name shall be stone. Its name shall be Zalak stone, its name shall be stone. Its entrails shall be the underworld." Killing, in this case, does not mean complete annihilation. Rather, the body of the enemy is submitted to transformation as Asak becomes the material substance for building the netherworld as part of the cosmos. In the beginning of the much later creation epic Enuma Elish, which in fact is a didactic poem telling about the rise of the city god Marduk of Babylon to supreme divine leadership, his father, the god Ea, kills Apsu, the primeval god of the freshwater ocean, in order to transform this god into his future abode. Apsu, consequently, is no longer one of the gods who determine the course of the events by means of their action, but is reduced to his cosmic dimension of representing the freshwater ocean. The whole passage seems to be an etiology to explain why Ea became the lord of the freshwater ocean. In the further course of the mythic narrative, the plot evolves around the future supreme god Marduk, who goes into battle to kill Tiamat, a primeval goddess who assumed the role of a kingmaker by empowering the figure of a usurper whom she sets up as an alternate line of succession, which is threatening the rule of the great gods. Thus, Tiamat's monstrosity primarily is defined by her action, aimed at usurpation, and thus creating an inner potential threat rather than being an outer chaotic force. Only in the wake of this action she will assume the outer appearance of a monster. This is one of the few instances that mythology openly acknowledges and negotiates the possibility of an inner threat rather than representing the chaotic forces as belonging to the realms beyond the borders of the controlled universe. Tiamat creates an army of monsters led by the rebel god Kingu to confront Marduk. The author's choice of dehumanizing and demonizing the enemy is a typical strategy of intraspecific aggression in order to break down killing inhibitions against the other. Trivializing killing inhibitions is a well-known device in historiographic inscriptions to legitimize aggression against the enemy. After his victory over Tiamat, a lengthy passage is dedicated to Marduk's building of the cosmos out of her corpse. He creates the heavens and places the earth above the freshwater ocean Apsu. He creates clouds and precipitation from her foam. Tiamat's head is turned into the source of fresh water by opening the rivers Euphrates and Tigris in her eyes. Heaping up the distant mountains on her breast, he drills a water hole to carry the catchwater, which probably refers to pools of water in the mountains that feed the springs that flow down to the plains. A transformative aspect of killing likewise applies to the killing of the rebel god supporting Tiamat, whose divine flesh and blood provide the substance for the creation of humankind. The killing of a rebel god in the Mesopotamian worldview consequently results in a positive consequence because killing the disruptive force establishes a new order in which humankind now assumes the former role of the gods in carrying out the labor of building ditches and temples. A reintegrative aspect of killing is argued in the Anzu myth, when the chief god Enlil, after his son Ninurta has killed the lion eagle, turns Anzu into the guardian of his temple, assigning to him a circumscribed minor status. So this is an image of Kalcho of the 8th century BCE, and here we have the Anzu depicted on a probably lintel of a temple, which dates much earlier into the mid-3rd millennium. In theological speculative text, killing of the ancestor gods to allow for a younger generation of gods to come to power qualifies this defeated older divine generation as belonging to the bound gods or dead gods. Bound gods and dead gods have gone through a process of demotion, often achieved by battle, as is described in an exegetical text which mentions the ghosts of Anu and Enlil defeated by the younger god Marduk, and clearly assigns the former generation of gods now to the netherworld, thus depriving them to a large degree of their agency in the human world. As we have seen in the textual sources just quoted, conflict represents a major theme in myth. Mythology provides divine prototypes of the warrior, a role to be assumed by the king, and invests him with cosmogonic significance. An early monument which reflects this concept is the stele of the vultures of King Eannatum, dating from the midst of the 3rd millennium BCE. And so thus 200 years earlier than the stele of Naram-Sin discussed by Zenab. In both text and image of the stele, the warrior god Ningirsu, patron deity of the city-state of Girsu and Lagash, this is the reconstructed version, figures as the icon of Lagash's victory over the city-state of Umma. On the obverse, Ningirsu is shown as the battle is over, holding a battle net filled with defeated enemies, as well as the lion eagle Anzu. Now I have to. Do you have the pointer? Oh, here. I don't see a red button. Oh, there. Okay. So here you see the Anzu lion eagle, which is a symbolic reference to his battle as told in the Anzu myth. And then in the lower register, you see the triumphal procession of the warrior god. Ningirsu's symbolic gesture of holding the battle net filled with defeated enemies is an image that is exclusively applied to the divine warrior, while the imagery used for the human warrior king is that of trampling down onto the defeated enemy, as it is shown on the standard of Ur dating to the mid-3rd millennium BCE, and then in Naram-Sin's Victory Stele, which we have seen, or in the slightly later Anubanini relief, for instance, and then it lives on into the Persian period in the Bisutun relief of Darius. Another variation is that of holding the enemy on a leash, as does Ishtar in the Anubanini relief. So here on the right side, you see the goddess Ishtar holding the enemy on a leash, a divine gesture which is then adopted much later in the 1st millennium by the Assyrian king Esarhaddon in his Samal stele. The reverse of Anatum stele is divided into 4 registers. The vultures that give the modern name to the monument are seen in the upper right. So here we are. And then you see the king advancing with his phalanx of soldiers, and they are walking over the naked enemy. And then in the 3rd register, you see, so here you see him on his chariot and with a spear directed towards probably the enemy king. In the 3rd register, we have a ritual scene with a libation performed by a priest, probably in front of Anatum, and he is standing on animals, but here you see the enemy bodies of the enemy piled up. And here we see King Anatum, which I would interpret as performing the final blow of death, although it's very fragmentary. The gesture of performing the final blow of death parallels the one performed by the king in hunting scenes, and thus illuminates the parallelism not only in the language, so in the description in text, but also in the art of hunting and war. Both the wild animal and the enemy represent emblematic forces of chaos which had to be continuously vanquished by the king, whose primary task was to maintain and re-establish the cosmic order as originally schemed by the gods. With this ideological underpinning of warfare, I would like to draw your attention to the libation scene on the Anatum stele, which as a ritualistic framework defines the king's military action as a cosmogonic act and underscores the cosmic role of the king. Thus, informed by myth, royal ideology conceives of warfare as an act of creation because it defeats chaos. In Mesopotamian thought, it is war and chaos which are antithetical, not war and peace. War is viewed as the continuous creation of the cosmic and social order. Peace is considered a state resulting from the political action of the king, who by means of warfare establishes righteousness, justice, consent, and peace. This kind of practical knowledge is already stated in the Middle Assyrian Tukulti-Ninurta epic. There will be established no peace without combat. A good relationship does not come without fighting. Mythology provides the template for Ashurbanipal's description of the killing of the Elamite king Teoman after the battle of Tiltuba at the Ulai River. Similar to the slaughtered rebel god Kingu in the Enuma Elish, Teoman is characterized as one who is guilty of rebellion. Because of this, Teoman is described as having disrupted the political and cosmic order. Therefore, the Elamite king has to die. It is only through death that the cosmic and political order is restored. According to his inscription, Ashurbanipal, having defeated Teoman, takes his head and presents it opposite the city gate of Nineveh like an offering in order to reveal the power of the gods Ashur and Ishtar. In a corresponding scene of the relief in the North Palace at Nineveh, as in the depiction of the whole battle in the Southwest Palace, the Assyrian king is absent. Teoman is beheaded by an Assyrian soldier. And here you can see the soldier beheading Teoman. The severed head of Teoman